In the last installment of this video series, I'm going to discuss America's involvement in China, in addition to the foreign affairs policies and key events of the Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson administration. Last video I mentioned that the U.S.'s decisive victory in the Spanish-American War had other countries taking note of their presence on a global stage. Europeans were further impressed by U.S. involvement in global politics as a result of John Hay's policies towards China. As McKinley's Secretary of State, Hay was alarmed that the Chinese empire, weakened by political corruption and a failure to modernize, was falling under the control of various outside powers. In the 1890s, Russia, Japan, Great Britain, France, and Germany had all established spheres of influence in China, meaning they could dominate trade and investment within a given sphere. And by sphere, I mean like a particular port or a region of China. So within these spheres of influence, also they could shut out competitors. So basically, each country controlled its own portion of China. To prevent the U.S. from losing access to the lucrative China trade, Hay dispatched a diplomatic note in 1899 to nations controlling spheres of influence. He asked them to accept the concept of an open door, by which all nations would have equal trading privileges in China. The replies to Hay's notes were evasive. However, because no nation outright rejected the concept, Hay declared that all had accepted the open door policy, and the press hailed Hay's initiative as a diplomatic triumph. As the 19th century ended, nationalism and xenophobia, which is a hatred or fear of foreigners, was on the rise in China. In 1900, a secret society of Chinese nationalists, known as the Society of Harmonious Fists, or Boxers, attacked foreign settlements and murdered dozens of Christian missionaries. To protect American lives and property, U.S. troops participated in an international force that marched into Peking, which is now Beijing, and quickly crushed the rebellion of the Boxers. The countries forced China to pay a huge sum in indemnities, which further weakened the imperial empire. Hay feared the expeditionary force in China might attempt to occupy the country and destroy its independence. In 1900, therefore, he wrote a second note, man loves a good note, to the imperialistic powers, stating the U.S.'s commitment to 1, preserve China's territorial integrity, and 2, safeguard equal and impartial trade with all parts of the Chinese empire. Hay's first and second notes set U.S. policy on China not only for that administration of McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, but also for future presidents. In the 1930s, this open door policy with China would strongly influence U.S. relations with Japan. In 1901, only a few months after being inaugurated president for a second time, McKinley was fatally shot by an anarchist. Succeeding him in office was his Republican Vice President, Theodore Roosevelt, or TR. Describing his foreign policy, the new president had once said that his motto was to, quote, speak softly and carry a big stick. The press therefore applied the label big stick to Roosevelt's aggressive foreign policy. By acting boldly and decisively in a number of situations, Roosevelt attempted to build the reputation of the U.S. as a world power. Imperialists applauded his every move, but critics disliked breaking the tradition of non-involvement in global politics. And here is a political cartoon with Teddy Roosevelt pictured as the world's constable, and a constable is a police officer. So hopefully when I talk about TR in a minute, you will understand why a political cartoon would refer to him as the world's constable. As a result of the Spanish-American War, the new American empire stretched from Puerto Rico in the Caribbean to the Philippines in the Pacific Ocean. And as a strategic necessity for holding on to these far-flung islands, the U.S. desired a canal through Central America to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans. And this was not the first time that the United States had wanted to build a canal or wanted the use of a canal to get over from the Atlantic to the Pacific quicker. But building a canal would be difficult. The French had already failed to complete a canal through the tropic jungles. And before the U.S. could even try, it needed to negotiate an agreement with the British to cancel an earlier treaty signed in the 1850s. Do you remember, hopefully, learning about that when the U.S. and Britain in the 1850s made an agreement that whatever canal was built would be built and would be under British and U.S. control, joint British and U.S. control. The new agreement was signed in 1901 and allowed the British agreement to let the U.S. build the canal alone. The young and active President Roosevelt then took charge. Roosevelt was eager to begin the construction of a canal through the narrow but rugged terrain of the Isthmus of Panama. He was frustrated, however, by Colombia's control of this isthmus and their refusal to agree to the U.S.'s terms for digging a canal through its territory. Losing patience with Colombia's demands of more money and control over the canal, Roosevelt orchestrated a revolt for Panama's independence. It's a pretty bold move, by the way. This was also not a congressionally voted decision. This was completely an executive decision that he funds and backs this Panamanian revolt. So Panama, though, had to sign a treaty in 1903 which guaranteed the U.S. all rights to the 51-mile-long and 10-mile-wide canal zone, as if it were a sovereign in perpetuity as if it were sovereign in perpetuity to keep U.S. protection. So basically, there was no time limit on this, that Panama had to recognize that the United States controlled the canal zone for as long as they wanted. Years later, Roosevelt famously boasted, "I took canal zone and let Congress debate." So basically, he just made the action and then sent it to Congress and said, okay, well, you can vote on this or you can't, but it's happening. Not a lot of people, some people were not too pleased by this behavior. The building of the canal began in 1904 and was completed 10 years later in 1914. Hundreds of laborers lost their lives in the effort to build this canal. And the work was completed thanks in great measure to the skills of two Army colonels. One was the chief engineer of the canal, and one was also a doctor who eliminated the mosquitoes that spread deadly yellow fever. Most Americans approved of Roosevelt's determination to build the canal, but many were unhappy with his high-handed tactics to secure the canal zone, basically using executive power and circumventing the legislative branch. Latin Americans, not surprisingly, were especially resentful. To compensate, Congress finally voted in 1921 to pay Colombia an indemnity of $25 million for its loss of Panama. In 1999, the U.S. returned the Canal Zone to the Republic of Panama to end the growing bitterness over the original treaty. I do also want to note that the canal, even though hundreds of laborers lost their lives, this was one of the biggest engineering feats in modern history. It's just mind-blowing the amount of industrial accomplishment that the Panama Canal basically brought to the United States. That this was a huge feather in their cap, basically. Not only would it make it easier for them to get from the Pacific to the Atlantic, but again, this is happening on a global stage, and people are taking note of America's ingenuity, of their work, and of their role in foreign affairs. Another application of Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy involved Latin American nations that were in deep financial trouble and could not pay their debts to European creditors. For example, in 1902, the British dispatched warships to Venezuela to force the country to pay its debts. In 1904, it appeared that European powers stood ready to intervene in Santo Domingo, which is the now Dominican Republic, for the very same reason. Rather than let Europeans intervene in Latin America, which would be a blatant violation of the Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt declared in December of 1904 that the U.S. would intervene instead, whenever necessary. And this policy became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. A corollary is a statement that follows an already made claim. So the already made claim in this instance was the Monroe Doctrine that was made in 1823, and Roosevelt's declaration that the U.S. would be responsible for mediating these debts then became a corollary. In reality, this meant that the U.S. would send gunboats to a Latin American country that was delinquent in paying its debts. U.S. sailors and Marines would then occupy the country's major ports and manage the collection of custom taxes until European debts were satisfied. As the 20th century began, Japan and the U.S. were both relatively new imperialist powers in Asia. Their relationship under Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, though at first friendly, grew increasingly competitive. An imperialist rivalry between Russia and Japan led to war in 1904, a war Japan was winning. P.S., just as an aside, that an Asian power was beating a European power, even one that other European nations didn't necessarily like, freaked out many world leaders. To end this conflict, Roosevelt arranged a diplomatic conference between the two in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in 1905. Although both Japan and Russia agreed to the Treaty of Portsmouth, Japanese nationalists blamed the U.S. for not giving their country all they believed they deserved in Russia. Despite their feelings, in 1906, President Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the negotiations, and he was the first American to win the award. A major cause of friction between Japan and the U.S. concerned the laws of California, which discriminated against Japanese Americans. San Francisco's practice of requiring Japanese American children to attend segregated schools was considered a national insult to Japan. In 1908, President Roosevelt arranged a compromise by means of an informal understanding, or what was known as a gentleman's agreement. The Japanese government would secretly agreed to restrict the emigration of Japanese workers to the U.S., and in return, Roosevelt would persuade California to repeal its discriminatory laws. I mentioned this in an earlier video, but to demonstrate U.S. naval power to Japan and other nations, Roosevelt sent a fleet of battleships on and around the world, on and around the world cruise, there we go, from 1907 to 1909. The great white ships made an impressive sight, and the Japanese government warmly welcomed their arrival in Tokyo Bay. An important executive agreement was concluded between the U.S. and Japan in 1908. Secretary of State Elihu Root and Japanese Ambassador Takahira exchanged notes pledging mutual respect for each nation's Pacific possessions, and also to support the open door policy in China. Roosevelt saw his big stick policies as a way of promoting peaceful solutions to international disputes. In 1906, the same year he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he helped arrange and direct the if I get this wrong, I'm sorry. Algeciras Conference in Spain, which succeeded in settling a conflict between France and Germany over claims in Morocco. The president also directed the U.S. participation in the Second International Peace Conference at The Hague in 1907, which discussed rules for limiting warfare. As an expansionist and an interventionist, and finally as an internationalist, TR embodied the vigor of a youthful nation arriving on the world stage. Roosevelt's successor, William Howard Taft, did not carry a big stick, so to speak. He adopted a foreign policy that was mildly expansionist, but depended more on investors' dollars than on the Navy's battleships. His policy of promoting U.S. trade by supporting American enterprises abroad was known as dollar diplomacy. Taft believed that private American financial investment in China and Central America would lead to greater stability there, while at the same time promoting U.S. business interests. His policy, however, was thwarted by one major obstacle: growing anti-imperialism, both in the U.S. and overseas. Taft first tested his policy in China. Wanting U.S. bankers to be included in a British, French, and German plan to invest in railroads in China, Taft succeeded in securing American participation in an agreement signed in 1911. In the northern province of Manchuria, however, the U.S. was excluded from an agreement between Russia and Japan to build railroads there. In direct defiance of the U.S. open door policy, Russia and Japan agreed to treat Manchuria as a jointly held sphere of influence. To protect American investments, the U.S. intervened in Nicaragua's financial affairs in 1911 and sent in Marines when a civil war broke out in 1912. The Marines remained except for a short period until 1933. Henry Cabot Lodge, who I've mentioned before, a Republican senator from Massachusetts, was responsible for another action that alienated both Latin America and Japan. A group of Japanese investors wanted to buy a large part of Mexico's Baja Peninsula, extending south of California. Fearing that Japan's government might secretly be scheming to acquire the land, Lodge introduced legislation which the Senate passed in 1912 called the Lodge Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The resolution stated that non-European powers, such as Japan, would be excluded from owning territory in the Western Hemisphere. President Taft opposed the corollary, but it passed through the Senate, and it also deeply offended Japan and angered Latin American countries. Okay, last of the presidents. In his campaign for president in 1912, the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson called for a new freedom in government and promised a moral approach to foreign affairs. Wilson said he opposed imperialism and the big stick and dollar diplomacies of his Republican predecessors. In his first term as president, Wilson had limited success in applying a high moral standard to foreign relations. He and Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan hoped to demonstrate that the U.S. respected other nations' rights and would support the spread of democracy. Hoping to demonstrate that his presidency was opposed to self-interested imperialism, Wilson took steps to correct what he viewed as wrongful policies of the past. Wilson won passage of the Jones Act of 1916, which granted full territorial status to the Philippines, guaranteed a Bill of Rights, guaranteed universal male suffrage to Filipino citizens, and promised independence as soon as a stable government was established. In Puerto Rico in 1917, Congress also provided U.S. citizenship for all inhabitants of Puerto Rico and provided for a limited self-government. Wilson's commitment to the ideals of democracy and peace was fully shared by his famous Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. Bryan's pet project, so to speak, was to negotiate treaties in which nations pledged to, 1, submit to international commissions, and 2, observe a year cooling-off period before a military action. Bryan arranged, with Wilson's approval, 30 such conciliation treaties. Wilson's commitment to democracy and anti-colonialism had a blind spot with respect to Mexico and countries of Central America and the Caribbean. He went far beyond Roosevelt and Taft in his use of the U.S. Marines to straighten out financial and political troubles in the region. He kept Marines in Nicaragua and ordered U.S. troops in Haiti in 1915 and the Dominican Republic in 1916. He argued that such intervention was necessary to maintain stability in the region and to protect the Panama Canal. Wilson's moral approach to foreign affairs was severely tested by a revolution and civil war in Mexico. As a supporter of democracy, Wilson refused to recognize the military dictatorship of General Huerta, who had seized power in 1913 by having the democratically elected president killed. To aid revolutionaries fighting Huerta, Wilson called for an arms embargo against the Mexican government and sent a fleet to blockade the port of Veracruz. In 1914, several U.S. sailors went ashore to Tampico, where they were arrested by Mexican authorities. They were soon released. However, Huerta refused to apologize, as was demanded by a U.S. naval officer. Wilson retaliated for this insult by ordering the U.S. Navy to occupy Veracruz, and war seemed imminent. However, it was averted when South America's ABC powers, which stand for Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, offered to mediate the dispute. This was the first dispute in the Americas to be settled through joint mediation. Huerta fell from power in late 1914. Replacing him was a more democratic regime led by Carranza. Almost immediately, the new government was challenged by a band of rebels loyal to Pancho Villa. Villa was Carranza's opponent when they were both vying for power. Hoping to destabilize his opponent's government, Villa led raids across the U.S.-Mexico border and murdered several people in Texas and New Mexico. In March 1916, Wilson ordered General John J. Pershing and an expeditionary force to pursue Villa into northern Mexico. They failed to capture Villa. It was rather embarrassing, actually. President Carranza protested the American presence in Mexico, and in January 1917, the growing possibility of U.S. entry into World War I caused Wilson to withdraw Pershing's troops. So that's it for the end, for the U.S.'s rise in imperialism. Next, we are going to be shifting to the First World War.